welcome back to the garage. So what we got going on today is that we're going to be replacing the bulbs in the back of the gauge cluster on the AW11. The previous owner had put in some blue LEDs, which are not really my cup of tea. Some people like them. One of them's not working. They don't really burn out like an incandescent bulb, but I don't really know what's going on. But the main thing is that the LEDs have a real hard time dimming in these older cars, so you end up with really, really bright or off. It's not really my thing. I do a lot of night driving here in the Northwest, so I like to run my cluster pretty dim. So we're just going to go back to a standard clear 194 incandescent bulb. I've run the clear ones in the past in my older 80s Toyotas. I really like the style. The green is fine too, but the clear is a little bit nicer for me. So it's a pretty straightforward job. There's 3 main bulbs on the back and a bunch of warning lights. I think we're just going to tackle the main bulbs. We'll see what it looks like once we get in there. So just some real basic tools, and I'll cover all that. Yeah, let's get to it. So really what you're going to want to start with is just starting to take the trim off around the cluster. It's a lot of Phillips head screws. There's 3 in the top here on the hood, and there's 2 in the back. I didn't get a shot of taking these out, but you can just see the pocket for it above the cluster in the rear. After that, the hood can come right off. It's kind of like an up and towards you kind of motion with this. Don't try and pull it directly off the top of it. You're going to break some of those tabs off. After that, you're going to want to take the screws on either side of the cluster out. There's 2 on both sides on the AW11. You can see them in this shot right here. There's a bunch of electrical connections we're going to have to remove here. They can be a little stiff, and this surround gets real brittle over time, so really be careful. Another thing you can do at this point is you can remove this metal frame, and there's just 2 10mm bolts. They're pretty far in there. Use some extensions and just be real careful. It is pretty close to the windshield, and you don't want to smack it with your socket. After getting the 10mm nuts off, it too just slides right out. After removing all the electrical connections, that cluster surround can sort of tip and roll towards you, and it'll come right out. So on the driver's side for the electrical connections, you can see them here. One is the headlight switch, and one is the defrost switch. Then on the passenger side, you've got the windshield wiper switch. You've got the interior gauge cluster illumination light just for when you open the doors. And this last one, I've actually never seen this illuminated on a my MR2 or any of them I've ever had. I think it's the windshield washer fluid level low lamp. Now with that stuff out of the way, we can actually remove the cluster itself. It's just a couple bolts around the corners. I used a Phillips head screwdriver for these. You can use a 10mm if you want, but they're not really stuck on there, so Phillips head works pretty well. Be real careful not to drop these at this point. If you do drop one, it will fall quite a ways, and it can be a little bit tricky to get out. There's a kick panel underneath the steering column. It'll get stuck in there in between like some of the HVAC tubes. So you can get it out, but just don't drop them. And I gotta say, I just fucking love 80s cars. Like, look at the detail on this cluster. Like, this is ridiculous and excessive, and it just is so rad. So next step is to remove the electrical connections on the back of the cluster. These can be a little tricky. It's a little tight back there, but there's 2 on one side, 1 on the other. And there's a little tab you got to release to get them out. After that, we're gonna get the speedo drive out. You can't really show this too well. It's on the back of the cluster. There's a little clip you're going to press down. You just kind of have to reach your hand in there. It's a little bit of a tight fit. It does come out a little bit, so you do have some room. But here's the clip here. You can see right where my thumb is. That's the piece that you have to release, and it'll just pop right off the back of the cluster. All right, so we got the cluster out of the car. You can see these are all little sockets that hold bulbs that give you your illumination in the cluster. The ones that we're going to be focusing on are these 3 in the middle. These give you your primary illumination for when you turn your parking and headlights on. Up here are your turn signals with your high beam in the middle and your fuel reserve over here. Your speedometer drive is right here, and your warning lights are here along the bottom. So these sockets come out real simple. You just turn them and pull them right out. So let's get to it. So as I started to pull these out, I realized that all of them, even the turn signals and everything, were LEDs. The only thing that wasn't swapped out was the fuel reserve lamp. And I ended up just swapping these all back to the normal bulbs. This is a real good time to check the connections on this sort of printed circuit board material on the back. They can get a little shifty over time. there's some repairs that you can do, and maybe I'll cover that in another video as well. I didn't really have a whole lot of problems with these ones, so I didn't have any issues to deal with. But it's a good time to check it because you don't want to get this thing all the way back together and have it not work on you. So here are all the bulb sockets out of the cluster. You can see these ones right here are the LED ones, and this one was for the fuel reserve light, and that's still one of the original ones that I'm not sure that works. So it's good to go through and we're just going to replace this anyways with a new one because we don't want to run out of gas. So these come apart real simple. Just grab them, hold the base, and just pull the bulb right out. That's it. So let's get to that, and we'll replace all these with our new bulbs. If you do have the original bulbs in here, keep in mind they are glass, so don't go grabbing them enough to crush them and blow one of these bulbs up in your hand. Not a lot of fun. The LEDs, you don't really have too much of a problem with it because the bodies themselves are made out of plastic. Same warning for putting them back together as taking them apart. Don't use a whole ton of force, they don't need it. If it doesn't feel like it's going in there, maybe it's not aligned, or maybe you got some material stuck in the bulb socket itself. Installation is generally the reverse of removal. This is really no different. So the first thing that you're going to want to get in there is the speedo drive. And again, it's a little bit tricky. You do kind of have to like place the cluster in there and just sort of stick your hand up underneath and just sort of clip it in. But it should go. Don't force it. It is like a square drive cable. So if you force it, you could damage something. Just make sure that it's aligned and that it just slides right in. After that, the electrical connections can go on. Keep in mind, same thing with the speedo drive. Don't force these in. They're going to slide right in. They're going to click. Then we can move on to the 4 bolts holding the cluster in. Then the gauge surround itself. So what I like to do at this point too is I will hook up the illumination switch, the headlamp switch, and I'm going to test the cluster before we go any further. So the electrical connections are on. It's bolted in, but before you put all the trim on, you just want to make sure everything functions, because if you got to take it back out, you want to eliminate as many steps as you can. You can see kind of the color difference here, obviously. It kind of goes back to a sort of a warm amber color. I like this a lot better than that blue we saw in the beginning of the video. Moving on to the electrical connections for the passenger side, we've got the wiper control switch, we've got that wiper washer fluid low lamp, and then we've also got that instrument cluster courtesy light. Driver side, defrost switch, the illumination switch, as you might recall, was already connected. Do be real careful when you're hooking these back up. Again, like I mentioned earlier, these gauge surrounds can get real brittle and they are crazy expensive for these MR2s now. So really take your time. You don't want to be cracking these things. That metal frame can come next. It's going to be a little tricky because we do have the gauge cluster surround already installed, but with a little care, it'll drop right in there. If you still have this little felt steering column surround in your MR2, now's the time to kind of tuck it behind that lower kick panel. Next up, we can move to the 2 bolts on either side of the gauge cluster. Here's a shot of one of the screws that I missed during disassembly. These are directly under the switches, like I said, on the wings. Typically, the gauge cluster surrounds are already cracked at this point. My driver's side one was cracked. I had to put a little washer on there to secure it. So again, gentle. It's not a strength check, like just tighten them so they don't go anywhere. Here's one of the other ones I missed on disassembly. You can see it's right above the mirror control switch. So there's one here and there's one directly on the other side of the steering column in the same exact spot. After the gauge cluster surround itself is tightened down, you can go ahead and put this hood on. Again, it's kind of like a down, in this case now it's a down and forward type of deal. It sort of slots in. It doesn't just drop straight on and it doesn't slide in directly from the front. You'll just have to take a look at this when you get it off and you'll see what I mean. After that's on, you can put the 3 screws back into the hood from the bottom. One more that I missed on disassembly for you guys. These are up towards the front of the hood. They kind of go in at an angle. Again, be super careful. These go into some pretty weak standoffs at this point. One of mine was cracked. I had to repair it before I put the hood back on. So again, tighten it, don't over torque it, just enough to hold that hood on. All right, got everything back together and working great. So like I mentioned, not a whole lot of tools, not a real complicated process, just keep track of where everything is going. So 10 mil socket, couple extensions, ratchet, 2 Phillips head screwdrivers, pick, pocket screwdriver, and whatever bulbs you're going to replace. You don't need a lot to do this job. It's a real simple thing to do, so don't let it scare you off. Back to that good old 80s goodness. Thanks for watching. We'll see you around the garage next time.